Welcome to Echocardiography Online Simulator. Left parasternal view, long axis.
Freeze echocardiogram.
Defreeze echocardiogram, freeze echocardiogram. Linear measurements. Aortic annulus diameter.
Aortic sinuses of Valsalva diameter. Aortic sinotubular junction diameter.
Proximal ascending aorta diameter. Linear measurements. Interventricular septum thickness at end diastole.
Left ventricular posterior wall thickness at end diastole. Left parasternal view, short axis at the level of
Freeze
pulmonary artery.
echocardiogram. Linear measurements. Pulmonary artery annulus.
Pulmonary artery trunk. Right pulmonary artery.
Left pulmonary artery.
Right pulmonary artery.
Apical four-chamber view. Freeze echocardiogram. Linear measurements.
Left ventricular and diastolic internal diameter. Linear measurements. Right ventricular and diastolic internal diameter.
Defreeze echocardiogram.
Freeze echocardiogram. Linear measurements.
Interventricular ventricular and systolic internal diameter. Left ventricular and diastolic internal diameter. Left ventricular and systolic internal diameter. Right ventricular and systolic internal diameter.
Left atrium minor size. Left atrium major size. Right atrium minor size. Right atrium major size. Volume and area measurements. Left ventricular and systolic volume.
Volume and area measurements.
Left atrium volume.
Volume and area measurements. Right atrium volume. Echocardiography calculations.
Left ventricular and systolic volume. Volume and area measurements.
Left ventricular and systolic volume. Left ventricular and diastolic volume. Volume and area measurements.
Left ventricular and diastolic volume.
Left ventricular and systolic internal diameter. Linear measurements.
Linear measurements.
Left ventricular and systolic internal diameter.
Left ventricular and systolic internal diameter. Left ventricular and diastolic internal diameter. Linear measurements.
Left ventricular and diastolic internal diameter. Epicardial area. Left parasternal view, short axis at the level of papillary muscles.
Freeze echocardiogram. Volume and area measurements. Endocardial area. Volume and area measurements.
Long axis of the left ventricle. Apical four-chamber view. Freeze echocardiogram. Linear measurements. Maximal velocity of the early diastolic filling. Pulse wave Doppler.
Simple Doppler measurements.
Maximal velocity of the late diastolic filling. Simple Doppler measurements. Septal E velocity on tissue Doppler.
Tissue Doppler.
Simple Doppler measurements. Lateral E velocity on tissue Doppler. Tissue Doppler. Simple Doppler measurements. Tricuspid regurgitation velocity. Pulse wave Doppler. Continuous wave Doppler.
Pulse wave Doppler.
Simple Doppler measurements.
Left atrial volume index.
Two-dimensional echocardiography.
Freeze echocardiogram. Volume and area measurements. Left atrium volume.
Echocardiography report. Dr. Michel Cook, conclusion, left ventricle diastolic function, grade 2 diastolic dysfunction.